Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in to part 2 of this DIY wood-fired brick pizza oven build. Let's get started on the second part. As you can see, I am going ahead and moving on to the third arch that I'll be building, but I am not building the arch that is directly adjacent to the first two arches. I'm moving on to the fourth arch, and the reason being is that I need to have the support of the fourth arch to build the chimney, and you'll see more of what I'm talking about later on in this video. Now I'm sure I'm going to get some questions about the pole that I'm building right next to. You can see that I'm building the oven right up next to this pole, which the reason I did this was because of the layout of my patio and the future projects that I want to take on with relation to my patio. I end up having to put some metal flashing on the face of the pole when I start to use the oven. But surprisingly, the fire brick that I use, really holds in the heat pretty well, and so I'm not at all worried about the pole lighting on fire. So that's good. If you haven't checked out part 1 of this build, make sure you check that out and get caught up with how I built the first two arches and some tips that I give with how I lay this heat-resistant mortar on the bricks as I build up the arches. Like I said in the first video, I'm using just a small trowel, a brick like cement trowel, to apply the cement mortar. And as I apply it to the bricks, I make sure to do a larger chunk of the mortar on one side of the brick, the side of the brick that is facing out on the outside of the arches, and then a smaller amount of mortar on the inside so that it kind of pushes the brick into the arch and makes it angle over, and so that the overall shape of the arch is nice and round. One thing you want to keep in mind as you're building up these arches with this mold in between with those loose fitted bricks that are underneath is that you check the level and the position of the arch throughout the build of the arch, because it will shift as you're moving or as you're putting more bricks down, and you don't want it to shift into a weird position. Then you forget about it and then it dries and you can't fix it. So just keep a good eye on the whole entire arch as you build it up. And like I'm doing right here, you might have to move to the other side of the arch and to begin to build that side up before you finish half of the other arch, or the other half of the arch. And the reason being is that so you have some bricks that are on the opposite side to support the mold and keep the mold from sliding over. Another thing that I mentioned in part 1 of this video is that I spent a lot of time worrying about the perfection of laying down this mortar at the beginning of the project. Every brick that I laid down, I felt like I had to smooth it out so it looked really nice and that the mortar looked nice on the outside of the bricks and that it was perfect. But I quickly realized that 1, that this was taking a ton of my time, and 2, I was going to be covering up the whole entire outside of this section of the oven. So I would recommend to you, don't worry so much about making it look pretty. You can kind of tell too that in these parts of, or these later arches, I've kind of dropped all need to try to make this look nice because, like I said, it's going to be covered up. So I'd recommend doing the same. Each of these arches would take me between 1 and 2 hours to complete, which is a good amount of time for one section of the oven. So you know, if you add up all the time that it takes to build each of the arches, as well as the base, as well as the back part of the oven, and then as well as the outside, it takes a lot of time. So this build overall took me about a month and a half to complete, and that's with me working a full-time job, and so I can't work on it all the time, so it'd be my evening work. So when I would complete one of these arches, it was so satisfying. I was so stoked to be able to finish one of these arches and be that much closer to having the oven completed. It takes a lot of time, but I think in the end it was definitely worth it. Another tip that I'll give to all the viewers who haven't seen part 1 of this build is to make sure you squeeze out all of the air bubbles in the mortar as you press it into or in between the bricks. You can see here that as I press that mortar down, I'm squeezing more and more into it, wiping the excess that squeezes out and then pushing it in again, and I kind of do this over and over again just to ensure that there's no air bubbles down in there, because the air bubbles could pop when you get a fire blazing, and you don't want that to happen because it could destroy a section of your oven. So after I completed that arch, I went ahead and let it dry for about 24 hours, if not a little bit longer. Then I use a hammer to beat out the bricks, the loose fitted bricks on the bottom, and then get the mold out. And then I can move on to the final arch. And the reason that I waited, and I kind of mentioned this before, but the reason that I waited to do this middle arch, or the third arch in, is because of the chimney. And I needed to have the support of an arch on each side of this arch so that I could only build up this arch to the top and then leave a brick out of the middle so that they could serve as the chimney of the oven. And you'll see a little bit more about what I'm referring to later on in the video, but I would recommend doing the same thing. Don't try to build this arch by itself. It would be a whole lot harder to do without the support of that fourth arch. One thing to keep in mind as you're building up this arch that is enclosed between two separate arches is that you need to cover both ends of the bricks that you put into place with the mortar so that you fully seal up the oven. The whole physics behind this build, and the reason that the chimney is at the front side of the oven, is the airflow. And what you want to have happen when you go to build a fire is you want to build a fire on the floor of the front end of the oven, let it kind of start up and begin to heat up the oven, and then you'll be able to push the fire to the back side of the oven and then use the floor where you actually built up the oven to cook the pizza. And the ideal thing to have happen is that the air will come into the oven and it'll go into the fire and it'll push the heat to the back side of the oven, then up the back of the oven into the ceiling of the oven, and then it will come back to where the chimney is located and then exit. And then, but as it's exiting, a lot of that hot air is going to fall onto the floor of the oven on the front side of the oven where you'll be cooking pizzas. And you'll get between, or the ideal temperature is between 500 and 800 degrees. And you can use a heat gun, which is what I use later on when I start to cook pizzas, and you'll notice. But to measure the temperature on the floor where you're going to be tossing some fresh pizzas. So hopefully, or at least at this point, I was really hoping that this would all work out. Kind of nerve-wracking, but you'll see later on that it does. So. Once I got to the top and there was only 3 bricks left to be put in place to complete a full arch, I took one of the half-cut arches and instead of using 2 of the full-cut ones, and those ones are just an inch thick or an inch and a quarter, something like that, so they're a bit thinner, but I use these ones in place of the full-size ones for this arch because of the chimney. And so that I'll have a section left out, or a gap that the air can flow through, and then later on I'll be building up the chimney part of it. And it kind of took some experimenting with the bricks. You can see here I'm placing the bricks in different places, trying to figure out the best way to build this up. And the way that I came up with was using 2 of the half-cut bricks for this, or to finish off this arch. Before I began the actual construction of the chimney, I had to experiment with the bricks to figure out the best placement of them to build up this chimney, and then I started mortaring them up. Alright guys, this completes part 2 of this DIY brick oven build. If you want to check out how I finish off this project and cook some really good pizza with some friends of mine, please check out part 3. It is posted on my channel, so give it a watch. Thank you again for watching and for tuning into Second Son Woodworks. Please subscribe, please comment, please share this to all of your friends, and build something cool.